For years, William believed his father's silences were about caution, not secrets. Then he opened a folder that was never meant to reach his desk, and inside it was proof that King Charles had been quietly rebuilding contact with Harry and reconsidering the fate of Andrew without a single word to his own heir. What looked like an ordinary afternoon at Windsor became the moment William realized he had been protected from his family's biggest decision instead of trusted with it. And the palace, for all its careful language, had no plan for what happened once he knew. Before we go further, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this investigation. Stories like this rarely end where they begin. Looking back now, the warning signs were always there. Most people just were not paying close enough attention. The folder should never have left Clarence House. That much William understood before he had even finished reading the first page. It arrived by accident, buried inside a box of transferred correspondence during a routine reshuffle of household paperwork. The kind of administrative shuffle that happens dozens of times a year without anyone above the level of private secretary noticing. Somebody had mislabeled a file. Somebody else had failed to check it before it crossed from one office to another. And because of that small, forgettable error, William was now sitting alone in his study at Windsor, holding evidence his father had never intended him to see. At first, it looked unremarkable. A handful of printed emails, a scheduling note, the kind of dry administrative residue that fills every royal office in the country. Then he saw the name, Harry. Not once, but across several entries spanning months, meetings, private, unlisted, deliberately kept off any official diary that journalists or household staff might ever cross-reference. William read the dates twice, certain he had misunderstood. He had not. His father had been meeting with Harry quietly, repeatedly, for months, and nobody had told him. William did not call for tea. He did not summon an aide. He sat with the folder open on the desk in front of him, the afternoon light moving slowly across the room, and he did the thing he has always done when the ground shifts beneath him, which is nothing visible at all. Years of training, years of watching his own face be read by cameras that never blinked, had taught him how to hold stillness even when stillness was the last thing he felt. But underneath that stillness, something had already begun to crack. It was not Harry's presence in the documents that struck him hardest. Brothers reconciling, however quietly, however overdue, was not in itself a betrayal. What struck him was the date on the earliest entry and the realization that sat beneath it like cold water. His father had made this choice around the same time doctors had given Charles the kind of update that makes a man start counting the conversations he has left in his life, instead of the ones he has already had. William had known about that appointment. He had not known what came after it. He turned another page and found something that made the room feel smaller. A short note, unsigned, clearly written by someone close to the king, advising that certain conversations be kept from William entirely until, in the words on the page, matters had settled enough not to burden him unnecessarily. Burden him. William read that phrase 3 times. He was 44 years old, the heir to the throne his father currently occupied, and somewhere inside his own family's machinery, a decision had been made that he was something to be shielded from rather than someone to be told. He thought of George. He thought, without wanting to, of every locked door he had grown up walking past as a boy, doors he was told led to conversations too complicated for him to understand. He had promised himself long before he became a father that he would never build that kind of house for his own children. And now he was sitting in a study at Windsor, discovering that his own father, a man he loved and had spent his whole life trying to understand, had built exactly that kind of house for him. There was a second name in the file, one that unsettled him even more than Harry's. Andrew. A handful of lines referencing ongoing conversations about his uncle's position, his residence, and how far the family should go in distancing itself from him. William had believed those decisions were settled, finalized, closed. The pages in front of him suggested otherwise, suggested that the matter was still being quietly weighed, discussed, and shaped by people who had decided William did not need a seat at that particular table. He closed the folder slowly. He did not call Catherine immediately. He did not call his father. He asked his private secretary in a voice that gave nothing away to keep the remainder of the afternoon clear, and then he sat alone in a room in the house his family called home, holding a piece of paper that had quietly rewritten everything he thought he understood about his place inside it. Catherine noticed something was wrong before William said a word. She has learned over more than a decade of marriage to read the particular quality of his silence, the difference between a man who is simply tired and a man who is holding something he has not yet found language for. That evening, the silence belonged to the second category. He sat across from her at the small table they use when the children have already gone up, and for a long time he did not touch his food. When he finally spoke, it was not anger that came out first. It was something quieter and, in its way, more damaging: disbelief. He told her about the folder, about the meetings, about the note that used the word burden as though he were a liability to be managed rather than a son to be trusted. Catherine listened without interrupting, the way she always does when William needs to finish a thought before anyone else is allowed to shape it. Only when he stopped did she ask the question that mattered most to her, which was not about Charles or Harry or Andrew, but about him. "Are you all right?" He was not, and both of them understood that pretending otherwise would help nobody. What Catherine feared more than the contents of the folder itself was what this discovery might do to a man who has spent his whole adult life fighting against the instinct to disappear inside his own composure. She has watched him do it before, retreat into a kind of controlled distance that looks like strength from the outside and feels from where she sits like watching someone quietly leave the room while still sitting in the chair. She was not going to let this become another one of those disappearances. Miles away at Clarence House, Charles had no idea any of this had happened. His week continued as it always does. Engagements, logged briefings, delivered the machinery of a working monarch, turning forward without pause. He signed off on a handful of routine papers that afternoon, unaware that one misfiled folder had already traveled somewhere it was never supposed to go. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that image: a father going about his ordinary evening while not far away his son sits with proof of exactly the kind of secrecy he had hoped never to be discovered keeping. The following morning, William watched his father from across a hallway during an unrelated engagement, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself studying Charles the way a stranger might, searching his father's face for some sign of the man capable of writing him out of decisions that would eventually be his to inherit. Charles smiled at him in passing, the same practiced, warm, distracted smile he has given his son for 40 years. William smiled back. Neither man said anything. It was in its own quiet way one of the more dishonest exchanges either of them has ever had. It would have been easier in some ways if William's anger had settled on Harry. A reconciliation between brothers, however overdue, is a story the public already understands, one that could be absorbed and even welcomed. But that was never where William's anger lived. What sat with him heavier by the hour was the architecture of exclusion itself. The fact that somewhere inside his own family, people he trusted had decided that protecting him meant keeping him blind. There is a version of this family one generation removed where that same instinct once shaped an entire childhood. Anne has never hidden her belief that secrecy dressed up as protection does more damage than the truth it is meant to soften. She has said as much in her own clipped and unsentimental way more times than the household would prefer to count. Charles, raised inside an institution that treated silence as a virtue, absorbed a different lesson entirely, one that told him difficult truths were something to be managed quietly rather than delivered plainly. He had spent his life trying not to become his own parents. In this one instance, without meaning to, he had. Catherine understood all of this without needing William to explain it to her, because she has spent years watching the patterns of this family repeat themselves in ways nobody upstairs seems willing to name. What she did not yet understand, and what neither of them could have guessed that evening, was how far back the decision to keep William in the dark actually went, or what had frightened Charles enough to make secrecy feel like the safer choice. To understand why Charles chose secrecy, you have to go back to a single afternoon that never appeared on any public schedule. It began, as so much in this family eventually does, with a doctor's appointment. Nothing dramatic was announced, nothing changed in the visible rhythm of his diary. But those closest to Charles noticed a shift in him afterward, a certain quietness that had not been there before, the particular stillness of a man who has just been given a version of his own mortality he was not fully prepared to hear. He did not speak about it publicly. He barely spoke about it privately. But in the days that followed, he asked his private secretary for something unusual, a quiet audience, unlisted, unrecorded, in the way these things normally are, with no aide present to take notes. Those who arranged his diary understood only that the king wished for an hour alone with his thoughts and soon afterward alone with his estranged son. The meeting with Harry that followed was not a reconciliation in the dramatic sense the public might imagine. There was no embrace captured by a long lens, no leaked photograph to fuel a headline. It was smaller than that and in its smallness more honest. Sources close to the household describe a father who had begun to understand in a way he had not allowed himself to. Before that time was no longer a resource he could take for granted. He did not want reconciliation as a public gesture. He wanted one honest conversation with his younger son before the chance to have it disappeared entirely. It would have been simple enough at that point to bring William into the decision. But Charles hesitated, and the reasons for that hesitation are where this story becomes less about scandal and more about a father who has spent his whole reign trying not to complicate his heir's life any further than duty already does. William was at that time deep inside a demanding stretch of public engagements, still carrying the residue of exhaustion from a period the household had quietly monitored for its toll on him. Charles, according to those familiar with his thinking, did not want to hand his son one more emotional weight to carry. Not yet, not before he understood himself what the reconciliation with Harry would even become. His private secretary put it plainly in a note that would later end up by accident exactly where it was never meant to go. Let it settle, the note read, before William has to carry it. At the time, it must have felt like an act of care, a father trying to shoulder something alone so his son would not have to. What nobody in that quiet office seemed to consider was how differently the gesture would read once William discovered it, not through his father's own voice, but through a misplaced file months later. There was a second thread running beneath the first, quieter still. In the same period, Charles had begun revisiting in private conversations with legal and household advisors the unresolved question of Andrew. Publicly, the matter appeared settled, the titles gone. The residents in dispute, the distance between Andrew and the working family treated as final. Privately, the picture was less tidy. Charles found himself weighing again and again how much further the family needed to go and whether some earlier decisions had been made too quickly, under too much pressure, without enough room for a fuller reckoning. It was not forgiveness he was considering. It was precision, the difference between punishment shaped by public anger and punishment shaped by clear judgment. Both threads, Harry and Andrew, sat inside the same instinct. A king increasingly aware of his own limited time, trying to settle unfinished business on his own terms quietly without drawing his heir into decisions that were in his mind still his to carry alone. It was in its way an act of love, clumsily executed. Charles wanted to spare William something. Instead, by keeping him outside the room, he had built the very kind of exclusion he always claimed to be trying to leave behind him. None of this was malicious. None of it was designed to deceive. But intention rarely survives contact with discovery, and what began as a father's private attempt to protect his son was about to be read entirely reasonably as something else altogether. Charles learned that William knew before William ever said a word to him directly. That is how these things tend to move inside a household built on discretion, information traveling sideways through aides and private secretaries long before it reaches the people it actually concerns. By the time Charles requested the meeting himself, he already understood that the conversation ahead of him would not be one he could soften with careful phrasing. They met without staff present in a room chosen deliberately for its distance from anyone who might overhear. William arrived composed, and that composure, Charles would later admit to someone close to him, was somehow more unsettling than if his son had simply been angry. Anger can be answered. Careful, deliberate calm from a man who rarely allows himself to show what he is feeling is something else entirely. William did not open with Harry. He opened with the note. He asked his father plainly whether he had instructed anyone to keep him uninformed about matters that would eventually be his to inherit. Charles did not deny it. He has never been a man comfortable with outright denial, and in this instance, denial was never going to survive the paper already sitting in William's hands. He said instead that he had wanted to spare his son a burden he was not yet ready to carry, that the decision had come from care rather than distrust. It was at this point that William raised the second name, and the temperature in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Andrew? William told his father that he had believed the matter closed. the family's position settled and final, and that discovering it through a stray folder rather than his father's own voice had forced him to question how many other decisions were being shaped without him. This was the moment that reframed everything that had come before it. It was never only about a quiet reconciliation with Harry. It was about the fact that decisions touching the future shape of the monarchy itself, decisions about family punishment, forgiveness, and public standing were being made in rooms William was not invited into, despite the certainty that one day he alone would have to answer for their consequences. Charles's response was not what William expected. There was no anger, no attempt to reassert authority. What came instead was something closer to exhaustion, a tiredness that seemed to reach back further than the immediate conversation. He told William in words that surprised them both with their honesty that he had spent his entire life believing that carrying difficult things alone was what a king was supposed to do, that his own mother had shown him nothing else, and that some habits, however wrong they may look from the outside, are harder to unlearn than people assume. It was not an excuse. William did not receive it as one. But it was for the first time in either of their memories something close to an admission that the silence Charles had built around himself was not strength but inheritance, passed down through a family that had always mistaken restraint for protection. William told his father quietly and without theatrics that he did not want the same inheritance passed to him, that if he was going to carry the weight of decisions like Andrew's future or Harry's place in the family, one day he needed to be trusted with them before they were finished, not informed of them after the fact by accident. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The stillness in the room said everything the words alone could not. Charles did not offer a resolution that day, and William did not ask for one. What passed between them instead was smaller and, in its own way, harder to walk back from a quiet acknowledgement. From a father that the very thing he had built his reign around, protecting his family from unnecessary weight, had itself become a kind of weight his son was no longer willing to carry in silence. The private discussion between father and son in that room did not remain known only to the two of them for long. Within days, the conversation had quietly become a matter for the household itself, filtered through the careful, unhurried language that royal institutions use whenever something needs to change without ever being seen to have gone wrong in the first place. Private secretaries on both sides were drawn into a review nobody wanted to name directly. Officially, it was described as an update to internal briefing protocols. Unofficially, everyone involved understood exactly what had prompted it. A folder had traveled somewhere it should never have gone, and in doing so, it had exposed something the household had never quite been forced to confront before, which was how much information touching the future of the monarchy itself was being withheld from the man who would one day hold it. The review that followed was not dramatic. There were no resignations, no public statements, nothing that would ever reach a newspaper diary column. But inside the walls of the household, a quiet reordering began. Conversations were held about what William as heir should be entitled to know, as a matter of course rather than as an exception granted at his father's discretion. It was in its own understated way an admission that the system itself had failed him, that protecting an heir from difficult truths and preparing him to eventually carry the weight of the crown were two entirely different things, and the household had allowed itself to confuse them. The Andrew question moved along a separate but parallel track. Legal and constitutional advisors already engaged in the long, unglamorous work of finalizing his position in residence found themselves now operating under closer scrutiny from William's own office. Where previously those discussions had been handled almost entirely through Charles's private channels, William's team began requesting visibility not to challenge the decisions being made, but to ensure he would never again learn of them secondhand. It was a small procedural shift, the kind of change that never makes a headline, but inside an institution built on centuries of hierarchy and precedent, it represented something close to a quiet correction of course. Camilla, for her part, stayed carefully removed from both threads. Those close to her describe a woman who understood perhaps better than anyone else in the household how easily this story could be reshaped into something about her, and who made a deliberate choice to let the resolution happen between father and son without inserting herself into it. Her restraint was in its own way its own kind of statement. What became clear in the weeks that followed was that the household had built its entire information hierarchy around an assumption that no longer held. For generations, the machinery of the monarchy had operated on the belief that the heir should be shielded from the more difficult or unresolved family matters until those matters had already been settled, tidied, made presentable. It was a system designed to protect the institution's composure, not necessarily the well-being of the person destined to inherit it. William's discovery had almost by accident forced a conversation that nobody inside that structure had ever been willing to initiate on their own. There is something quietly significant in the fact that none of this required a public announcement to matter. Constitutional monarchies rarely change through declaration. They change through small procedural adjustments that accumulate slowly until one day the shape of the institution is simply different from what it was before. This was one of those moments invisible to the public, unremarkable on paper, and yet significant enough that those inside the household understood exactly what it represented: a quiet acknowledgement that the next King of England had nearly been kept outside the room for one of the more consequential family decisions of his father's reign. None of it undid what had already happened. William still carried the memory of reading that folder alone in his study, still carried the particular loneliness of discovering his own exclusion by accident rather than by his father's voice. But something in the architecture around him had shifted quietly, permanently, in a way that would outlast this single episode. The first sign that something had genuinely changed was small enough that most people around William would never have noticed it. His weekly briefing schedule, drawn up months in advance by his private office, suddenly included a handful of meetings it had never contained before, sessions specifically focused on matters touching succession planning and family governance, the kind of material previously reserved for Charles and his closest advisors alone. Nobody explained the addition out loud. Nobody needed to. William understood exactly what it represented, and so did the small circle of aides who had quietly arranged it. The coordination between father and son's diaries shifted as well in ways that were procedural rather than personal, and precisely because of that more telling. Where once certain categories of correspondence had passed exclusively through Charles's private secretary before any decision was finalized, a new unremarked upon protocol now ensured that William's office received parallel visibility. It was never announced as a correction. It functioned as one regardless. Those inside the household who noticed the change understood it as the quiet bureaucratic equivalent of an apology. The kind an institution built on precedent and restraint is capable of offering without ever using the words itself. Camilla's team, meanwhile, made a deliberate and careful adjustment of its own. Public messaging, connected even loosely to the Andrew situation, was handled with unusual caution in the weeks that followed, statements reviewed more closely. Language stripped of anything that might suggest Camilla's office was shaping decisions that belonged first and foremost to Charles and increasingly to William. It was a small retreat barely visible to anyone outside the household, but inside those walls it read as an acknowledgement that the boundaries around this particular story needed to be drawn more carefully than before. At home, the visible change looked entirely different and far more human. Catherine, without ever framing it as a response to what had happened, began quietly reshaping William's calendar in the weeks that followed the discovery. Engagements that could be delegated were delegated. Evenings that could be protected were protected. She did not ask him to talk about it further than he already had. She simply made sure he had the space to sit with it, to process what trust and betrayal and inheritance had come to mean inside his own family without the added pressure of a schedule that assumed nothing had happened at all. It was in its own quiet way the clearest evidence yet of how differently Catherine and Charles had each learned to protect the people they love. Charles's instinct, inherited from his own upbringing, had always been to shield William by withholding to believe that difficulty carried alone was difficulty spared for someone else. Catherine's instinct ran in the opposite direction entirely. She protected William not by keeping things from him, but by standing beside him once he already knew, absorbing the practical weight of his days so he had room to carry the emotional weight of what he had learned. William noticed the difference, though he did not say so directly to either of them. He noticed it in the careful new briefings that arrived on his desk, evidence that the institution itself had bent, however slightly, toward including him. And he noticed it in Catherine's quiet, unglamorous rearranging of his diary, evidence that at least one person in his life had never needed a folder or a mistake to know exactly what he needed. Neither change undid what had already happened between him and his father. The memory of that afternoon in his study alone with a folder that was never meant to reach him remained exactly where memories like that tend to live, close to the surface, ready to resurface the next time trust and secrecy crossed paths inside this family. But something had shifted in the architecture around him visibly enough now that even those least inclined to notice such things could see it. The conversation that finally settled something in William did not happen in an office, and it did not happen with his father. It happened late one evening after the children were asleep in the quiet, unremarkable stretch of time that Catherine has always guarded as the one part of the day that belongs entirely to the two of them. She did not raise the subject first. She rarely does. Catherine has learned over years of watching William process difficulty in his own time that pushing him toward a conversation before he is ready only teaches him to close the door faster the next time. So she waited the way she always does until he brought it to her himself, sitting across from her with the particular stillness that had settled over him since the afternoon he first opened that folder. He told her he did not know how to feel anymore. Not about Harry, whose quiet reconciliation with their father he found, once the initial shock had passed, harder to resent than he expected. And not entirely about Andrew either, though that question still sat unresolved somewhere beneath the surface of every conversation with Charles. What unsettled him most, he admitted, was smaller and more personal than either of those threads. It was the discovery that his own father, a man he loved and had spent his whole life trying to understand, still believed that loving someone sometimes meant deciding on their behalf what they were strong enough to carry. Catherine listened to all of it before she said anything. When she finally spoke, she did not ask him to forgive Charles, and she did not ask him to excuse what had happened. She asked him something else entirely, a question that reframed the entire evening. She asked him what kind of father he wanted to be to George when George was old enough that difficult truths would eventually be his to carry as well. William did not answer immediately. It was not a question he had allowed himself to sit with directly, though some version of it had clearly been circling beneath everything he had felt since that afternoon in his study. Catherine did not fill the silence for him. She let it stretch the way she always does when she knows the answer matters more than the speed at which it arrives. When he finally spoke, what came out of him was less an answer than a resolve. He told her he did not want George to ever discover something important about his own family through an accident, through a misplaced folder, or a careless word from someone who thought silence was protection. He wanted his children to be told the truth, even the difficult parts, in his own voice and on his own terms, long before the world or an accident had the chance to tell them first. It was in its way the exact promise Diana had made to her own sons decades earlier, delivered now in a different generation shaped by a different discovery, but carrying the same conviction underneath it. Catherine recognized the echo even if William did not say her name aloud. She reached across the table and did not say anything more. She did not need to. This conversation did not undo what had happened with Charles, and it did not settle the unresolved questions still sitting quietly around Andrew's future. Institutional decisions rarely bend to a single evening of honesty between husband and wife. But something in William had shifted by the time they finally went up to bed that night, a resolve that felt sturdier than the anger it had grown out of. He was no longer simply reacting to what his father had done. He had begun quietly and without any announcement deciding what kind of father and what kind of king he intended to become instead. Catherine had not changed the institution. She had not resolved the family's oldest wound. But she had given William something he had been missing since he first opened that folder alone, which was the clarity to stop asking what had been taken from him and start deciding what he refused to pass on. No institution keeps a secret forever, and this one had never been as contained as the household hoped. Whispers about a quiet, unresolved distance between Charles and William had already been circulating among royal commentators for weeks, fragments picked up from small procedural changes. A shifted briefing schedule here, a reworded statement there, the kind of detail that means nothing on its own but becomes unmistakable. Once enough of it accumulates in front of people whose entire job is noticing exactly that. It began, as these things often do, with a single carefully sourced remark from a journalist known for having genuine access inside royal circles. Speaking on a widely followed royal podcast, he suggested that Charles's quiet efforts to rebuild his relationship with Harry may end up creating real difficulty for William further down the line, phrasing it as a question rather than an accusation. the sort of question that lands harder precisely because it refuses to draw its own conclusion. Within hours, that single observation had detached itself from its original context and taken on a life of its own across news outlets and social platforms alike. From there, the story moved the way royal stories always move once they leave the privacy of the household faster than anyone inside the palace could manage, and shaped by voices who had never sat in that room where William first confronted his father. Commentators who had spent years building entire careers on reading royal body language and diary changes began connecting details that had until now seemed unrelated. A shift in William's briefing schedule, a public appearance where father and son seemed subtly out of step with one another, a vague procedural statement about updated household protocols that nobody outside the family had thought twice about at the time. Panels convened, columns were written. The word crossroads, once used quietly by a single royal expert to describe growing friction between Charles and William, began appearing everywhere, repeated so often it stopped sounding like analysis and started sounding like established fact. Some commentators framed Charles sympathetically, a father reaching toward reconciliation with an estranged son before time ran out, doing the difficult, overdue work most families avoid until it becomes too late. Others framed him less kindly, suggesting a king who had allowed personal reconciliation to compromise the trust of the son, who would one day have to carry the weight of everything he left unresolved. The palace communications office, caught between competing instincts to clarify and to protect, chose the option. Institutions almost always choose in moments like this, which was careful, deliberate silence. No statement confirmed the details circulating, none denied them either. Aides fielded questions with practiced noncommittal language, acknowledging nothing beyond the fact that family matters remain private, a phrase so familiar to seasoned royal reporters that it had almost stopped meaning anything at all. Inside the household, the noise outside changed nothing about the private resolution William and Catherine had already reached between themselves, but it did complicate the emotional terrain Charles now had to navigate publicly. He found himself, for the first time in this entire episode, forced to manage not just his relationship with his son, but the perception of that relationship playing out across headlines he had never wanted written in the first place. Every public appearance became something to be read for hidden meaning. Every photograph of father and son standing near one another was studied for distance, tension, warmth. Anything that might confirm or deny what the commentators had already decided they knew. William, for his part, said nothing publicly, and those close to him describe a man who found a strange, unexpected clarity in watching strangers debate a story they understood only in fragments. He knew the truth of what had happened between himself and his father, the exhaustion behind Charles's silence, the resolve it had left him, with the promise he had made to Catherine about the kind of father he intended to become. None of the headlines came close to any of that. And in its own way, that gap between the public version and the private truth gave him something to hold on to amid the noise, a reminder that whatever the country believed it understood about this family, some things still belonged only to the people living them. The engagement had been on the calendar for months long before any of this began. A formal public event neither Charles nor William could have rearranged even if they had wanted to. By the time the day arrived, both men understood exactly how closely it would be watched, not for anything either of them planned to say, since neither intended to say anything at all about what had passed between them, but for everything their bodies might reveal in the few seconds cameras would have them standing close enough together to matter. The arrival itself unfolded the way these things always do, a practiced sequence of greetings and handshakes. Aides positioned with quiet precision, the entire choreography rehearsed so thoroughly that it looks effortless to anyone who has never had to learn it. Charles stepped from his car, first composed in the way decades of public life have made second nature to him. William followed a moment later, and it was here in the space of only a few steps that the story the cameras would eventually tell began to take shape. Protocol calls for a particular distance between the king and his heir during formal arrivals, a small deliberate gap that photographs have captured 1,000 times before without anyone thinking twice about it. On this occasion, William closed that gap slightly, not dramatically, not enough to draw a comment from anyone standing nearby, but enough that the difference registered instantly to the photographers whose entire craft depends on noticing exactly this kind of variation. The fraction of distance between what is expected and what actually happens. Charles noticed it too, Those close enough to see his face in the moment described something brief crossing it. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition, as though he understood precisely what his son was choosing to communicate without saying a single word. As they turned to walk together toward the waiting officials, Charles's hand rose and settled briefly on William's shoulder. It was there for only a moment before it dropped away again, an ordinary, almost unremarkable gesture between a father and son standing side by side. But nothing about this particular father and son has ever been ordinary in the eyes of the cameras trained on them, and this gesture, brief as it was, became the image that outlasted every headline the previous weeks had produced. Neither man spoke about it afterward, not to reporters, not even according to those closest to them to each other in any direct way. There was no interview clarifying what the moment meant, no statement confirming or denying the significance commentators immediately assigned to it. And yet within hours, that single photograph, William standing a half step closer than protocol required, Charles's hand resting briefly on his shoulder, had traveled further and said more than anything either man could have offered in words. Royal commentators, the same voices who had spent weeks speculating about distance and crossroads and quiet institutional friction, found themselves studying a different kind of evidence entirely, one that could not be quoted or sourced or attributed to an anonymous aide. Some read reconciliation into it, others read simple duty, two men performing the roles expected of them regardless of what passed privately between them. Both readings, in their own way, were probably true at once. What nobody watching from outside the family could have known was what that small physical closeness actually represented to the two men standing inside it. It was not resolution. The unresolved questions around Andrew still sat unfinished somewhere between them. The wound from that afternoon in William's study had not disappeared simply because a photograph suggested warmth, but it was in its own quiet, wordless way an acknowledgement neither man had yet managed to put into speech, a small gesture standing in for every difficult conversation they had not yet finished having. The cameras captured only seconds. What those seconds carried for anyone who understood what had come before them was closer to the truth than any statement the palace could have written. In the weeks that followed, the story slowly receded from headlines, the way most royal stories eventually do, replaced by newer speculation, newer photographs, newer questions the public had already moved on to asking. But inside the family itself, something had shifted permanently, quietly enough that no announcement ever marked it, and lasting enough that everyone who lived through it understood exactly what had changed. William gained something from that folder his father never had at his own age, though it took him time to recognize it as a gift rather than a wound. He had proof now, in the clearest possible terms, of what it costs a family to mistake silence for protection. Charles had inherited that instinct from his own upbringing, absorbed so early that he had never fully questioned it until his son sat across from him and named it plainly. William, for all the pain the discovery had caused him, would not carry that particular inheritance forward. He had already told Catherine as much in words he intended to keep. Charles, for his part, never spoke publicly about any of it and likely never will. But those closest to him describe a man who in private quietly admitted something he had never allowed himself to say aloud before, that he had underestimated how much his son needed to be trusted rather than protected, that the very care he believed he was offering had instead become its own kind of distance between them. It was not a grand confession. Charles has never been a man given to those, but it was in its own restrained way as close to an apology as the two of them were ever likely to receive from each other, understood rather than spoken the way so much in this family always has been. The Andrew question, unresolved through most of this story, eventually settled through the same slow procedural machinery that governs everything in this institution, decisions reached, quietly announced, without ceremony, absorbed by the public within a news cycle or two before attention moved elsewhere. What mattered more than the outcome itself was the process that produced it, a process William had for the first time been genuinely present for rather than informed of afterward. Catherine's role in all of this remained, as it so often does, largely invisible to anyone outside the family. She had not resolved the rift between father and son. She had not rewritten household protocol or forced an institution to reconsider its oldest habits. But she had given William something none of the procedural changes around him ever could: the clarity and steadiness to turn his anger into resolve instead of distance, to decide what kind of father he intended to be before the moment demanded it of him unprepared. In a family built to present itself as symbols rather than people, she remains the one most consistently insisting that her husband stay a person first. There is a version of this story that ends simply with reconciliation, a father and son closer than before, a family quietly healed by honesty, finally spoken aloud. That would be the easier ending, and it would not be entirely true. What actually remained in the months that followed was something more complicated and more real. A relationship reshaped rather than repaired, built now on the understanding that trust once broken by silence has to be rebuilt in far smaller, more deliberate pieces than it was ever lost in. Diana once believed her sons deserved the truth rather than a version of it softened for their protection. She said as much in her own way more than once, and paid a cost for that belief that neither of her sons has ever fully stopped carrying. Decades later, her eldest son sat with his own wife and made a quieter version of the same promise. Not to the world, not to the cameras waiting outside every gate, but to the small private life he was still trying to build inside a family built for exactly the opposite. He would not build his son a locked door. He had already opened one by accident, and he did not intend to let his own children ever have to do the same.